Josh J. Vintage Honda Minis, Orlando, Florida. No break for me. We're gonna keep moving forward to get this motor installed and get all these components. But what we're looking at is the kind of the necessary parts to get the 12 volt swapped in, based on us using this Trail Buddy sub harness. That's gonna be the harness that goes in between the OEM harness I'm leaving in place and then in the engine that's being installed now. Need to put a 12 volt high tension coil in place. We need, actually I found this on my shelf. I didn't know I had an extra one, but TB, or not TB, but Trail Buddy's three-way petcock that they sell. You have the CDI box, which is the ignition for the 12 volt Lifan engine, and then that other part that I showed we needed to buy that didn't come with it is your regulator rectifier. And what that does is regulate the voltage so it doesn't overvolt to your battery or your electrical system, and rectifies the electrical signal from AC from the flywheel to a DC, which is what the battery wants, as a DC electrical. Alright, so we'll go ahead and just start getting these. Oh, and also a 12 volt battery we're putting in place instead of the 6 volt system. So we'll go ahead and start working on this bike and getting all the parts put in place. The other thing is, you know, you're gonna have to make a decision with the gas tank. I'm gonna leave the 2 lines in place and then run it to the 3-way petcock, because the carb, like for example the carb that comes in this kit only has a single fuel port. Where is it? Oh, it's right here. It's already installed. So the port, there's only one, and then on the OEM petcock you have 2 nipples, and it's built into the carburetor. So we got to take the 2 lines and turn it into one for the different carbs that come on these Chinese engines. First thing that we're going to do is, since we got the engine out, now we have access to the 6 volt high tension spark coil. If you didn't know, it's shoved up here, so if it fails or you have any or your main lead from your high tension coil gets sheared or becomes really bad, and you could always put a splice on and extend it, but if you have to get it out, you have to essentially pull the engine. I think some people have managed to work around pulling the engine, but it's very difficult and time consuming. So if we look in under here, you can see that bracket that's part of the frame. There's those 2 nuts here. On the other side, that is your coil, so these nuts are holding your coil, and so we're going to use a 10mm socket and remove these nuts to pull out this coil. 2 nuts are out, so you can get this out, and then it has this 1 lead that goes to the factory harness, so we're going to go ahead and just give it a pull and get it disconnected so we can get the 6 volt coil out of place. Alright, so we're going to take a minute to look at the sub harness at this point and kind of go over all the connections that are part of this setup. The harness, it comes with a little sheet that tells you what color and some explanation of what the wire is doing and what its use is for. The note is that this sub harness is good for CT70s 1976 and below. It should be a kind of a plug and play setup. The harness is made, you get an option like the YX140 engine architecture or the Lifan 125 style engines. So I selected Lifan for this particular engine, of course. It does have a option for electric start on it, so it's got the leads that would go to the starter solenoid and starter. But on this one we have a kickstart engine, so we're not going to use those. But you do have your leads to your battery, the 12 volt battery that we're going to use. It has a frame ground. This is going to be a standard connection for the 12 volt regulator that I said that we needed to buy. So that could bolt right in or snap in there. It's a 4-pin regulator. You have a built-in fuse. Let's see what else we got going on here. This is going to be your leads for your stock regulator. I'm going to show that we do away with the regulator. Actually, it's not a regulator on this bike, it's a rectifier that's near the battery. We don't have a regulator by the same definition of what this would be. It's just a rectifier, selenium rectifier on these old bikes. And then you've got your CDI connection, which again is going to connect to your engine's spark CDI. We have all the connections that are going to go to the new Chinese engine. So the stator on the Chinese engine has all the connections. I haven't even looked at how the connections are, if they're bullet terminals or not, but these will all connect to the engine and send the appropriate electrical to correct pathways, and they are all labeled, so you can see CDI lights. You know, it's pretty straightforward. It's not too terribly confusing when you take a second to read through everything. Then you have your leads for your coil, which came in the engine kit. Of course, this is our 12-volt high-tension coil, which has 2 bullet connectors. I'll have to splice this off and put the spade connectors on for this guy. And then on the very far end of this sub-harness, you have the connector that looks just like came off the CT70H stator lead. So this connector will then plug into the factory harness up in the frame. Alright, I'm going to do some soldering, so I'm going to work on getting the battery hooked up. What I'm going to do is cut these leads off this old 6-volt battery, reuse all this stuff, cut them off this battery, and then make some connectors that are going to allow me to connect right there on those spade connectors. And then I'm going to solder on the high tension coil for the spark plug so that the leads can connect to the sub harness. Take this and cut here. So this battery's garbage, but I'm going to reuse this to make that battery easily connectable to the old OEM harness. Our spade connectors, those are 4.8 millimeter spade connectors, these smaller ones on this battery. This is a sub harness, requires the male spade connector, but these are 6.3 millimeter terminals. Okay, so 4.8 on the battery and 6.3 here. So we got our coil mounted back up in there. It's got these leads with the spade connectors that we soldered on. But it's good practice right here to make sure that you're bare metal, that you can ground the chassis of the coil to this bracket inside the frame. Not so much for this one, because this 12-volt high tension coil has a ground lead on it. So it's going to ground back into the harness, and you'll be grounding the frame in other places. And then you got your spark lead. But if you're looking at the OEM, if you ever do painting or powder coating and reinstalling your coil after the fact, this only has a power lead and no ground lead. And the frame of this coil needs to ground the chassis. So it's important to keep good practice to keep that area bare metal so that you can get a ground from your coil chassis. Next thing we'll do is we'll get our sub harness in place. I'm going to go ahead and pull the battery tray and get the harness down, and we're going to put it down in here nice and neat and make its connections and such. So let's go ahead and get this off, and then we'll start tucking it in there. What I did was this is the 6-volt OEM harness engine connector. That's usually down there at the engine mount area. So I pulled that back up, and then I reached in and pulled the 12-volt high tension spark plug coil leads, the positive and negative.
I pulled that up so I can work with it, and I'm going to hook that up to the sub harness I'm going to place here. So let's go ahead and get those connected. So green to green for the high tension coil. Or he just calls it the coil positive and coil negative. Alright, and then we're going to make our OEM stock harness. That's what it's, STK harness connection is how it's labeled here. We're going to make that connection from the sub harness to the OEM harness connector here. Okay, and then what we also have down in this area of this sub harness is all the leads that are going to plug into the Lifan engine. So I'm going to go ahead and push all this back down. Get this protective sheathing over that. Push this all back down there so I can get this part of the harness to come out where the engine is. And then we'll have the rest of the sub harness lead to work with up in this area. So you can see what I mean when I'm trying to get this Lifan connection out. So now it's hanging down to make the connection with the engine. So we're looking at the frame ground on the sub harness, and I like to use this seat latch bolt as a frame ground. So I'm going to pull this bolt out, maybe pull both these out, remove the latch, and then make some clean grounding condition, and then use this as an area to put this eyelet ground ring here and bolt it down. Ready. I just do a little cleanup here to just test the ground on the continuity. I got the there's a bolt back here on this tail light that grounds the frame, so I'll touch that and then touch where my new sub harness ground is, and pretty good ground, almost, there you go, zeroed out, so we're good. Just to clear up any possible confusion, I'm holding up a black wire. It's coming off the original CT70 harness. This bullet connector went to the original 6-volt high tension spark plug coil, so we are no longer using this anymore. It doesn't need to be connected to anything, so it's okay by itself, not having any connections. You can keep that just tucked down underneath the battery tray. Alright, so from the sub harness, find the 12-volt CDI label, then you put your CDI that comes with your Lifan engine, connect that in, and then your 12-volt regulator. From the sub harness connector, put that regulator on that I bought from Amazon separately, and then we're also gonna do the removal. This is the regulator, not the regulator, but the rectifier, selenium 6-volt original rectifier. Now we're gonna use the sub harness and plug in the sub harness where these originally plug into the OEM harness. So you're removing the selenium rectifier, it's going away. And then you're going to take the sub harness connections, plug those in where it says stock voltage regulator, right? So those leads from the sub harness now plug in where the original harness would have accepted that selenium rectifier. Green in the green, red in the red. Okay, and then we're going to unbolt this and remove this from the battery tray. But at this point, everything can kind of be tucked in there as it is, and what we want to do is I'm going to leave the CDI box and the rectifier. We'll just have these leads from the sub harness, which are the battery leads from the sub harness up here, and then you also have the original battery connector from the main harness up here. And then I'm gonna, so I took, like I said, I took the selenium rectifier off. We don't need that anymore. We're down to the final connection, and this is the battery connection and discussion here. So the Trail Buddy sub harness has a couple circuits. It's all one circuit, but it has many multiple leads that are feeding the regulated rectified voltage to the battery. Okay, so based on their way of installing this, you are gonna not use the OEM connection from the OEM original harness. This is a part that would go to your battery, right? So I cut that off the old 6-volt battery, this connector. So the way that they have this set up is that you don't want to even, you wouldn't use this connection, right? You just tape this off from the original harness, tuck it away, and then you're going to use the 2 leads that are left over from what we have remaining on this sub harness. This is your negative battery connection, so you hook it up to your black, and then this part has a fuse on it and it runs to the battery positive. So those are 2 battery connections, okay? And we do away with the OEM plug. But you also can do it another way, which I'm gonna do it. So the way I'm gonna do it is, like I said, there's redundant electrical current going through this sub harness, and the way that I kind of think about this is that I'm not going to use these wires on the sub harness. I'm going to use the OEM battery connection from the OEM harness, okay, to plug into the 12-volt battery. So we got power going through these. And and the way that, you know, this is useful is if you have an electric start engine. So if you're plugging this in and then you have an actual electric start engine, this lead here that would go to your starter solenoid, that is when I would use these wires, right? But to keep things like kind of OEM-ish looking, I'm gonna use the battery OEM connector with that snipped and soldered connection from the old battery to plug this battery in line. Okay, and what I mean redundant power from the sub harness is that these are powered, then you also have the same power going through this part of the sub harness feeding to, you know, where the original engine would plug in. So you also got power running into this feed into the OEM harness, and then you also have the 12-volt rectified regulated voltage running from the sub harness into the OEM harness where the old selenium rectifier was plugged in. So you got 3 different ways that power are all coming together. So what I'm going to do is actually just get these taped off, the positive and negative, tape these parts off, and then tuck them in underneath this battery tray so this is all out of the way. And then I'm going to rely on the OEM harness to supply the 12-volt current via this connector to the battery, so it kind of looks OEM. Alright, so hopefully that doesn't confuse you. It's like I said, it's just redundant, and there's plenty of power getting to this battery depending if you just use that connection or the way I'm doing it, or both. Doesn't even matter. You can do them both if you want. Just a visual, I'm taping off my negative battery from the sub harness and the positive, both leads from the sub harness to the battery, and I'm going to tuck these down underneath the battery tray and get them out of the way. I wouldn't snip these just because, you know, down the road you might even want an electric start engine. You might upgrade to like a 140 electric start, or, you know, 190 electric start, so it's just good to have this for that install style. So I'm just going to tuck that out of the way and use the battery. Reason you don't need the negative battery connection, because when you plug in the original harness, it will allow that circuit to be applied via the key switch. That's how you turn off and on the bike. You ground to earth. So by using the setup I'm doing, you're still getting all the key functionality on and off. Ground, actually you ground through this key switch. So finished the install, all our wires are nice and tucked underneath. You got your battery hooked into the main harness. I left the voltage regulator rectifier up here so that we can access it in case we need to troubleshoot. It's tucked nice and clean down there. And then the CDI box connects onto the OEM box just nicely, so that's sitting right there. And basically it's just a really nice clean look. Last thing you need to do for the electrical, which I'm not going to go over, is pull your rear brake housing, light housing off, change it to a 12-volt bulb. Same thing at the front. You got one bulb in there for the headlight. Get that opened up and then replace your bulb on your lens. And then you have, I don't remember if it's 1 or 2 bulbs, but you have to switch that over to a little bulb. So that's going to wrap up the electrical side of the engine swap. And then next video is going to be the getting the engine in, doing the chain and sprockets, and whatever else is needed for the mechanical side of things. Alright, thanks for watching, guys. Please subscribe if you don't.